see. And yeah, so can everyone hear me okay in the back? Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you today about my career at Novartis. And I just want to thank the organizers so much for inviting me here. I've had a really great time so far. Yeah. So, next. So this presentation, I'll just quickly talk about my career path. I'll give an overview of kind of what Novartis is like. And at the end, all the presenters have talked about sort of the importance of communicating effectively in industry. And I think that's sort of one of the biggest challenges in going from academia to industry. And so I'm going to spend a little time talking about how one can do that. So first, for my career path. So actually, I started out as a mechanical engineer. But I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, so I really liked the modeling side of things. I wasn't so, as thrilled with the design side. So I took a year off after my master's and worked in a car interior company. And during that time, I guess realizing that the modeling was what I really liked the most, I thought I would focus more on the modeling tools. And so that's kind of what made me decide to get a PhD in applied math. And I would say while I was getting my PhD, I actually did a summer internship at Novartis. And so I would, echo Jeff's comment that I think like an internship in grad school is one of the, if you're considering industry, I think it's one of the most valuable things you can do. And in terms of how to do it or how to find them, I mean, my approach was just Googling and finding people in industry doing things, math and pharmaceuticals, and just trying to find the right people to contact. And I think often just trying to find the right people can be more effective than, officially applying through I guess the standard channels. So then I did a 2-year postdoc at the IMA. And after that, I joined the modeling and simulation group at Novartis. It's now called Advanced Quantitative Sciences. And for me, one of the motivating factors was just the chance to work on so many different problems. And not all of them turn out to be interesting, but all of them do turn out to be useful in some way. And by working on so many different things, you can sometimes find the ones that are really both mathematically interesting and useful, and kind of, if you're careful, like kind of, I guess, manage your time so you can work on those types of problems. Oops. Sorry about that. I pressed the wrong button. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our group at Novartis. So just for some background, so Novartis is a Swiss pharmaceutical company with about 130,000 employees and around 60 billion in revenues. And some of their biggest money-making drugs are Gleevec for leukemia, Diovan for high blood pressure, and Lucentis for macular degeneration, which can cause blindness. But Novartis works in like a wide variety of pharmaceutical areas, including cardiovascular, immune and infectious diseases, and cancer. And here, I wanted to describe this law. It's called Eroom's law. And it's maybe the opposite of what you'd expect. So every 8 years, the cost of efficiency of drug development is halved. So what this is showing here is the cost, how many drugs you can develop per $1 billion. So back in 1950, you could develop 20 or 30 drugs for $1 billion. Nowadays, maybe only half a drug is the best you can do. And what's odd is that over this time span, we've learned so much more about biology. We understand the structure of DNA, we've done sequencing, we've cloned sheep, and we have the Human Genome Project. And there's a number of kind of factors that might be involved. Things such as, there's this one idea of just the better than the Beatles hypothesis, where, once the Beatles come up with a great rock song, are you going to be able to beat it? It's a lot more challenging to get to the next step than to start out at the beginning. And another challenge too is just that the regulatory burdens have gotten bigger and bigger over time. But so one of the things that what we try to do, oh, I'm sorry, I wanted to bring up one point. So the reason this is called Eroom's law is it's actually more spelled backwards. So this is the exact opposite of what you see in the computer industry, where every couple of years the number of chips, the number of transistors you can get on a chip doubles. So what our group in Advanced Quantitative Sciences does is we try to quantitatively integrate data across all the relevant studies, across different animals and humans, to try to improve understanding and make predictions. And again, it's always in order to inform some sort of decision. And so here too, it can't just be a mathematically interesting problem. We have to do something that informs a decision. So some example decisions might be the design of a drug or drug selection. So for instance, there's some drugs they're making now that can bind 2 molecules at once. And the idea is, so what's the optimal way of designing each arm? Are there cases where you don't need that, and simply having a combination of 2 individual drugs would work just as well? Another question often that comes is you've taken a drug to a certain point, and you want to know, should you continue to invest in the next stage of development or stop here? And finally, a question that we always ask is sort of what is the right dose and regimen of the drug for the patient? So how do you balance safety versus efficacy? And I would say in our group, people have a wide range of backgrounds. So we have a few mathematicians, physicists, and engineers, but there's also statisticians, pharmacologists, and even some medical doctors. So I thought here I would just give like a one-slide example of a problem that I worked on. So Afinitor is a drug that was first developed for treating metastatic renal cell cancer. And it was approved at a 10 milligram dose that prolonged sort of progression of the disease by about 4 months. But it had some side effects, and in particular stomatitis, or kind of an inflammation of the mouth. And so there was a question that the doctors had is, could you start at a lower dose of 5 milligrams and be just as effective and possibly safer? And so the data that we had was we would have each patient's daily dosing history, and we would also have bi-monthly tumor assessments. And so the model that we developed would link the change in the tumor size to the growth of the tumor. To the drug. So, I'm sorry, let me say that again. So we had a model for the change in tumor size. And the tumor could basically do 2 things. So when there's no drug present, there's a natural growth rate, which we described by R. And then there's a tumor shrinkage that's due to the dose. So this effective dose is a function that could change each day depending on what dose they received. And so we would fit this model to each individual patient. And that's what's shown down here. And what you can see, for instance, so on the top is the dose of the drug. So the patient started at 10 milligrams, and then they switched down to 5 milligrams. And so you see here the tumors were shrinking up, in the first 4 months. And then once you have the dose interruption, and then you go to a lower dose, you see the tumors start growing again. And so the model let us quantitatively describe the hundreds of patients in the study and say that, yes, we could see that 10 milligrams in terms of efficacy was superior to 5 milligrams. So I just wanted to talk quickly about some trade-offs between industry and academia. It's great, I think, working as part of a large team where people have a large range of expertise. And so there's many opportunities for learning about statistics or about pharmacology, or about like new math that I maybe hadn't known when I started. And we also have support for a lot of standardized tasks. So in particular for writing papers, there's usually someone we work with that helps manage the references and manage all the comments from all the reviewers. And so that's really nice. We have lots of data and lots of interesting problems to work on. And for me, there's been a nice balance between work and life, and that I generally don't have to work on weekends. Occasionally something will come up and I'll have to, but I mean, normally it's around a 40 or 50-hour work week. I'd say some limitations, though, are that the problems that we work on do have to have practical value, and we often need to demonstrate that value to people that don't necessarily have a quantitative background. as part of a team, our plans and publications have to be approved by others. And although we're still encouraged to publish, it's not a top priority. So for me, I've been able to publish about 1 paper a year. And then, of course, industry doesn't have tenure. So finally, I just wanted to talk about the importance of communication and how to communicate more effectively. So there's this really powerful case study of the Challenger explosion. This was back in 1986. Where this was one of the U.S.'s space shuttles that exploded. And the reason that it exploded during launch was because of an O-ring failure, the failure of a seal. And the question to ask after the fact was, could this have been avoided, or did people know there was a risk? And actually, the engineers involved before the launch tried to communicate to the decision makers that there was a risk to launching at cold temperatures. So the temperature the night before the launch was around 0 degrees Celsius, which was much, much colder than any launch had ever happened before. And so they wanted to communicate that risk and the fact that the cold temperatures could lead to increased damage. And so the way they communicated this was faxing something like 13 different tables like this to the decision makers. And what they're trying to show is that at cold temperatures, you have a risk of damage. And so these SRM were two example launches. Blow by means damage. And they don't even tell you what temperature each of these happened at. So then you have to go from here to this table here. And somehow they were hoping that the managers would glean from all of this that that at cold temperatures there was a risk. Whereas after the fact, Edward Tufte kind of analyzed this same data, and he just plotted here. So on the x-axis is temperature, and one key thing he's plotting is he's even plotting all the cases where you had a launch with no damage. And so at the high temperatures, you generally have none, although sometimes you did. But then this SRM-15 is at the coldest temperature they'd ever launched at, and that was at the most damage. And where the Challenger launched was way down here. And so, of course, there's always danger in extrapolating these curves, but you have to think if the managers had seen this clear, at least this trend in the data and the big uncertainty gap here, this would be a much more effective way to communicate. I'd say even in presentations today, an important thing to do is just making sure people are able to read the different axes on the different texts and labels. And finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how one can structure communication before giving a talk. And so a couple key things that I always try to do is I think to myself, so what are the key objectives for this talk? So what do I want to get out of it, and what do I hope to get from the audience from this? And also to think about the audience and what is their background and why they're going to care about what I have to say. I think a standard math talk is you have a quick introduction, and then you spend a lot of times on the methods, because that's where you put a lot of your energy, and that's where you did your most innovative work. But for an audience of decision makers that might not even understand the methods, I think the key thing to do is to really think about what their agenda is and what you hope for them to take away from it. And so I show here that an outline that I usually try to follow now before even writing an email or preparing a document, is I'll start out by trying to explain the situation from the audience's perspective. And you actually explain it back to them to just help set the scene and because they have so many different things going through their mind, they see that and they're like, okay, I see why this is important. I need to focus here. And if you make a mistake, they can actually tell you right at the beginning, no, this isn't the important part, this is the important part. And that can actually make your meetings a lot more effective. But then, so you talk about you state the key problem the audience is facing, and then right at the beginning you tell them, how does your work address that problem? And once you do that, you really have their interest. And then you can really go through and give a structured argument for how your solution works. And that's where you can really talk about sort of the methods and the results that you generated. And then finally, at the end, I think it's also always important to end with what are the next steps. So what do you hope to get from this meeting or from this presentation afterwards. So anyway, that was all I had here, but thanks very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So I guess we will take questions for both speakers.
Oh, sure.
In your industry, with kind of the move towards personalized medicine and developing kind of drugs for individual patients, are there some new kind of mathematical challenges that are arising because of that?
Think about that. I mean, a lot of the biggest challenge I often see is just collecting the data fast enough into the form you need. A lot of from what I've seen, the mathematical tools are usually there because they were kind of developed for the clinical trials.
The one example you showed where you were fitting the model to data, these were data for individual patients, right?
That's right. Yeah, I would say like a direction things are moving is towards Bayesian statistics, where you have kind of a prior for how you think the typical patient behaves. And then as you get more information, you kind of update that prior in a way. And so I think that's an active area of research now.
Yeah.
I think these days, all the situation, the environment has been changed. So nowadays, we can do applied mathematicians can make something by ourselves. So what I've done is I made it by myself. Almost everything I made it by myself. I think that the suggestion that to learn programming, that is really essential for the applied mathematician to make things tangible and then make the own product by ourselves. Then we can not behind the other guys. We can be at the front, I think. Initially, he had an idea that that is just based on the engineering, like a Fourier transformation. He just thought that if we can change that into that Fourier domain, then he can solve such problems. So for the very simple case, like one or two appliances, that is possible. That was the solution. But after adding several appliances, that is not enough. So he realized that the mathematics is essential, but his ability is not far away.
Okay. Any more? Okay. So it's lunchtime now. I know we had a long morning session, so you must be tired.